Okay, welcome to the Woke-ademia podcast from the Salem Center at the University of Texas, Austin. Obviously, the University of Texas, Austin doesn't like this, but we do it anyway. And I'm very happy to have Wilfred Reilly here to talk about some of his work related to what's acceptable in society and academia. Professor Reilly was, I believe, had a successful career as a businessman and then pivoted to academics and as a political science professor at Kentucky State University. So thank you very much for joining us.
Of course. Yeah. Glad to be here.
Yeah, and I guess the two books that your two recent books that I think are related to our discussion are the book Taboo and the book Hate Crime Hoax. So if you could just give us a little intro to what whichever one you'd like to start with would be great.
Yeah, sure. So no, thanks for having me on, obviously. And so my background, I have a political science PhD from Southern Illinois University and a law degree from the University of Illinois College of Law. And you're right, I was in business for a while, but pretty standard academic credentials. And I actually still obviously do academic political science. I'll be at the upcoming Midwest Political Science event, looking at how different governmental structures and responses such as lockdown affected COVID-19 spread in different countries.
Oh, I haven't seen that.
Yeah, it's an interesting paper, a pretty standard quant paper, but I also, one of the things that I became interested in really as a graduate student, I started doing some side papers on things like why prosecutors win in local jurisdictions. Is it skill or is the system just set up to really make, are there plea bargains bluntly in 99% of cases? And I became interested in these sort of, to what extent are the things that are widely perceived in middle and upper middle class contemporary society based in reality. These sort of sacred cow questions became very early on something that I wanted to focus at least a percentage of my energy on. And that's what both of the books reflect. So Hate Crime Hoax grew out of an experience that I actually had in Chicago. I was a member of the graduate student community in that city. I'd gone back to Chicago to deal with a family health issue. And there were all of these high profile hate stories that anyone in the city at that time would remember. The bar Velvet Ultra Lounge, for example, was burned nearly to the ground. This was a club that was popular with, bisexual female students, and thus with everybody else, is the sort of joking but real line, but very gay friendly, large, sexual flexy audiences dancing there. It was set on fire and someone wrote these awful anti-gay slurs throughout the bar. And this was universally viewed as an anti-LGBT hate crime for obvious reasons. And this kept happening. There was an incident at the University of Chicago where a campus activist named Derek Cockaline claimed that his Facebook page had been taken over by an entire conservative hacker group that he called the U Chicago Electronic Army. And that these people were threatening him with, for example, anal rape. So this was a front page story in the Tribune. I believe it made the Journal. This is another one that everyone heard about. Down the road at Michigan Tech, there was an incident where a white engineering student allegedly threatened to shoot every Black student on campus. This just kept happening. Wisconsin Parkside in the northern Chicago suburbs, there were nooses, found throughout the campus. There were at least 2 of them. And there were lists of death threats targeting all the Black, well, not all, many of the Black students on campus that were pinned to trees, if I recall correctly. Again, a pretty major story. There's at least one that I'm forgetting, by the way, that was in Chicago itself as part of this sequence. But the short version is that all of these collapsed. They turned out not to be true. The Velvet Rope story was almost Shakespearean in what happened. I mean, it turned out that the owner had owed a lot of money to different people. And he had essentially set the bar, very Chicago story, but he had essentially set the bar on fire to collect insurance money.
I mean, if a bar burns down in Chicago,
you have to.
Insurance fraud associated with the mob should be like pretty high on your list, right?
Yeah, you don't want to stereotype, but you got to ask some questions, but like, yes, that actually is, I don't know if the mob per se, Italian-American organized crime was involved, but that turned out to be pretty much the story. But this was only revealed when this guy's boy was caught in another state, like driving drunk with a woman. You can still read, I forget all the details, but you can still read about them in the insurance press. It was a pretty well-known case. And he apparently snitched on his friend and explained what had happened with Velvet Rope, that the bar had been, set alight, so on down the line. So this guy, the club owner, was arrested and was given, I think, a year in jail. He's actually out and opened, last I looked, another venture called Bonsai Bar that was doing pretty well. So anyway, a really lengthy, funny story there, but there was not wild, as with Jussie Smollett, there was not wild anti-gay hate on kind of the north side of Chicago or the immediate surrounding suburbs like Oak Park. But the same thing happened with all of the cases. I mean, the Cocaline case, he turned out to have just done this to himself. I mean, a lot of people don't understand how easy it is to trace the IP of a computer, thus Tor and so on. I mean, there's a website, whatsmyip.com. The federales, who are many levels above that, were obviously just able to identify exactly, there'd been one machine in this side of the room, let's say, he logged into it and targeted social media on another, he logged into his Facebook page and posted the content himself, something like that. So I don't think he did any time, but was, shamed. He was shown to be the person responsible. The Michigan Tech thing was another kind of crazy collapse. All these stories are almost entertaining, but that guy, there'd been a fight between black and white students on campus or something like this. So that guy had originally sent out a tweet saying, I'm going to shoot every black person I see a big smile tomorrow. This isn't how we do things at MTech. This is an engineering school. Calm it down, boys. And a campus rival had screenshotted it and cut out the words, a big smile, and then gone to campus security and said, this crazy man is going to shoot every black student on campus tomorrow. So like the SWAT team kicked in his door. He faced terrorism charges, and he was sort of desperately saying, well, look, no, here's the post. This is what I actually said. So charges were dropped pretty quickly, but the school kept, academic discipline is insane. The school kept pursuing disciplinary proceedings, charges against him, even after he'd been totally cleared in criminal court. This went on for about a year, almost ruined the guy's career. He did get through it, as I understand. I'm actually not going to name this guy. But just on and on. I mean, the Parkside thing turned out to be fake. The reason that the Parkside case was determined to be a fake, by the way, is that the only name spelled correctly on the list of African-American students, many of whom had ethnic names, was the hoaxer. So the police going through this, they see this list of 10 or 15, 20 names and this terrible threat. And so they start contacting each person, and they notice that only one of them had their name and information up there correctly. So they began to ask, how'd that happen? Were you involved in this? And she broke pretty quickly under questioning, and the case was closed. But after that happened, I began to ask, how many of these stories that we see in the popular press, I mean, and obviously these were a few years later, but Jussie Smollett, Covington Catholic, Erica Thomas, Nikki Jolly, Duke Lacrosse, how many of these turn out to be real? So the book Hate Crime Hoax involves me actually looking at highly covered stories of racial conflict and hate crime, or hate incident in some cases, and seeing how many of them collapsed down road. And for the high profile cases, it was a very large number of them. I mean, every case I just mentioned turned out to be fake, as did a number of other very high profile situations. Most of the University of Missouri, the Yasmin Suede hijab tearing, the KKK spotted on the Oberlin campus. I mean, things that produced policy solutions. Taboo kind of takes that principle of what's really going on and extends it to sort of what at the time were 9 or 10 of the most widely debated issues in the country. So chapter 1, and again, this book writing would have started in about 2017. So some of this may seem a bit dated now, but at that point, I think only Heather McDonald had really unpacked some of these claims. I mean, chapter 1 is how accurate are the numbers used by the Black Lives Matter movement? So again, in 17, 18, 19, even early 20, I mean, it was very common for people like Cherno Biko to claim that hundreds or thousands of unarmed, the brothers is the term that comes to my mind, but African-American men were being essentially murdered by the police every year. Biko gave that estimate on primetime Fox News. I mean, this is widely believed. And again, that sort of American upper middle class, polite life world. And
the surveys we give our students are kind of like, oh, wow, you guys have absolutely no idea what's going on this stuff. So.
Oh, you've done that too. How many unarmed Black men, how many do they believe are killed on an annual basis?
There's a handful in the hundreds and then a concentration in the thousands. And like nobody has the right number. Like one or two people have the right number.
Yeah, what I've
it improved this year, I think, possibly because the selection for the class where we run that survey changed. But yeah,
it also might just be that the tide is broken. I mean, what you see with a lot of these stories, as with COVID, is that eventually information from the IDW or even the evil dissident right or the true radical class edge of the left will creep into the mainstream media. It'll feed through the Matt Yglesiases and so on first, and then you'll start seeing it on CNN. And the next step will be mainstream thought leaders pretending they invented it, while a bunch of people on Reddit are sitting around saying, no, I mean, we were debating this left versus the right 3 years ago. But it's the same thing with cloth masks don't work. I mean, Leana Wen said that 2 weeks ago. I mean, everyone I know in the general quant community has known that for several years. I mean, there's been research on this from countries like Vietnam that goes back 20, 30 years. What should you have on your industrial workers? So, I mean, but actually this one theme of a lot of my work in that public intellectual space might be, I'm not occasionally heterodox. I think that the majority of things that the typical upper middle class citizen believes are wrong. This would be true across how to personally and sexually please your partner. If you look at why evangelical couples are happy, that's certainly not the focus of this discussion between two dudes today. But I mean, that would be true across medicine, lose some weight, buddy. That would be true across spiritual and personal belief without getting in a mockery of the great religions and the agnostic alternative. I mean, but it would certainly be true in terms of the fears that you experience on a day-to-day basis, what you think the average risk of, say, a plane crash is, a child kidnapping is. So I don't think that there is occasional false information coming out from the mass media sources in this country. I think we do a better job in academia, but when you look at just mainstream public intellectual stuff, I think most of the furores and panics and so on are completely baseless. But at any rate, in Taboo, I've done similar things in terms of the number of people that the average smart young person thinks are killed by the cops. But did you see the piece from Skeptic Research Center where they actually did like a large in on this and they surveyed thousands of people?
Yeah, I think I saw that one. It was pretty disturbing, really.
Yeah, the average very liberal, not the average, only less than 40% of them. But I mean, people thought that the mean number killed in a year is like about 10,000 was one of the options.
You would have noticed that if it was true. Like that's what it's like. I mean, I understand people have false beliefs because they're being fed. Like this is the sort like the numbers that people believe. You would notice this sort of thing. That would have been people seem to be able to maintain these beliefs in the face of the complete absence of any evidence. It's fairly remarkable.
It is. I mean, the fact that most people are innumerate goes into it. I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, like, how many cities are there in the country in terms of organized political places that have a non-volunteer police department of more than 5 guys? I wouldn't be surprised. The answer is 10,000. Yeah. I mean, so in every one of those, is there a corpse? Is there a popular young black man that was just shot? There are only about 20,000 murders in a year. And I mean, we are overrepresented among the victims, but what are blacks? 9,000, 11,000? I mean, so to say that there are more unarmed black people killed by cops in a year than there are black people, or in some cases, people killed in a year. I mean, that's the level of the false information that we're dealing with. But at any rate, I mean, I looked at the BLM numbers. Again, Heather McDonald had looked at this first. I don't think many other people had. But and the Washington Post at that point was starting, a couple of years back, actually, they had put up the counted good database. But I mean, so the actual numbers, without crediting every social scientist in the game, turned out to be 17 on average. That's what I got. I mean, in the most recent year on record, which would, I think 2020's first full year. No, 2021's up now. There's literally 17 actually, and the Washington Post. So that's the first chapter. I look at the claims of BLM. And remember, Ben Crump had been prepping for a couple of years and had gotten out a book called Open Season, The Legalized Genocide of Colored People, where he argues that there's an ongoing anti-Black genocide in America. And this guy, again, I mean, he has the equivalent of a graduate degree. He's one of the country's top 10 or so attorneys. He's quite a smart guy if you've seen him in court, like, all jokes aside. But he's literally, this nonsense came out and people were talking about these figures, 5,000, 10,000. So that's chapter 1. And again, it's important to recognize that disconnect. It's not that people on that quantitative center right are trying to downplay the reality of only 5,000 people being killed or something like that. There's some debate about the numbers. The reality is that many people believe that the number here is 10,000 and it's 17 or 12, I believe, the year before that. Like, the narrative is totally baseless. It's not rooted in reality. the 12 figures an estimate, but it's that way across every year. I mean, I start with an analysis of the year 2015, and it was very similar. I mean, there were 1,000 people total shot by sworn officers that year. First, only 250 of them were Black. I mean, there are plenty of white and Hispanic criminals, which is something that I don't really see why you wouldn't emphasize as a Black person. But at any rate, less than 100 unarmed men of all races were shot, and I believe that year 25 of them were Black. Under 12 were Black people shot by white officers. Again, I don't have this data in front of me, but it's just remarkable the difference between the perception and the reality. But like chapter 2 of Taboo, and I won't go through every chapter of the book, people feel free to buy it. But I mean, like, chapter 2 looks at this idea, and this is driven by left and right wing media, honestly, but that there's a near race war going on in the country, that there's the constant ethnic conflict in the streets. I mean, Barbecue Becky, Pool Patrol Paula, Coupon Carl, and then in the reverse, I mean, the Fox News, for example, presenting the illegal immigrant killer of Kate Steinle, a tragic case, at least that last one. But I mean, as you probably know, when you pull up the actual figures on interracial crime, I mean, in a typical year, there are about 20 million index crimes. If you go to the BJS report, there are 20 million crimes serious enough to be noted, shot along by departments of the FBI. The majority of these offenses, at least in terms of offense description, would be violent, but you also have to work in burglary, carjacking. I don't suppose that's a fully nonviolent crime, but whatever, we're not getting into psychology here. Home invasion, that sort of thing. And of those 20 million index offenses, about 600,000 are specifically violent offenses that involve a Black perp and a white victim, or a white perp and a Black victim. That's 3% of index crime. Like if you actually wanted the simplest sentence here, interracial violent crime is 3% of index crime. Person most likely to kill you is your wife or your husband. But if you really want to talk about this, the right, if anything, has a better argument here. Not that opposing Blacks is a rightist thing or something, but if you want to look at what direction this should be focused on, interracial crime in the year that I used in my data set was about 80% Black on white, more than that actually. So if you want to reduce interrace crime, you'd probably be starting in blue cities with heavily minority populations. Like, the problem isn't, we saw this when another piece I wrote was unpacking Stop Asian Hate. But if your claim is that this sort of violence in the streets is driven by white supremacy or something like that, you're just playing political games. I mean, there's no evidence of that of any kind.
We literally had an official letter from the University of Texas, Austin, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, all their representatives from each university, wrote a thing about how horrible white supremacy was in murdering all these Asian people in these cities. And it's just with absolutely no shame or absolutely no interest in looking at actual data. And that was a kind of a stretch, but at least, this is like universities will give their official stamp of approval to these types of ideas, which I wonder if that feeds into the fact that all these upper middle class people believe this nonsense. Is it our fault?
I think so. I think it's the institutional release of bad information. And this is true across a whole line of portals. I mean, I teach a cybersecurity class, and for one of the classes, we were looking at this idea of morality in cyberspace. So the concept was, technically speaking, you can search or pursue almost anything on the internet, but you can't, say, download it. You can't take in child pornography or, terror plot outlines from the darknet ISIS website or something like that. But one of the problems with discussing this in the class was that there was so much false information out there. All these local lawyers on their websites were actually saying things like, if you do X, Y, and Z on a computer, search X term, that's a crime, and you should contact me for my retainer of X amount of money. And it was just, you had to get through like 12 of these to get down to the ACLU saying, no, this is a moral question. If you are involved in that cyber sex space, you can do this, but should you? You can't download things. Anyway, the point here isn't, and don't go to terror websites, kiddos listening, but the point here was,
I concur.
Good advice. Two academics agree on it. But no, the point here was simply that the real information had been buried under this deluge of panicked false information. And this is common in, as I'm assuming, false information. I tend to believe the actual free speech attorneys on this. But I mean, this is common across a whole range of fields where, for example, Scientific American has recently run pieces denying that biological sex and race in any population variation sense of that term exist. And I would say that the first of those ideas is nonsensical, and the second is at least contested. So again, if you are not an expert consumer of information, how do you determine the validity of piece X as versus piece Y? Why wouldn't you believe Scientific American? They have a nice looking graphic with a guy with breasts and a penis, so that is a significant problem, I think.
We spend, I've been stuck on this for a long time. We spend a lot of money on higher education, and some of that is like real stuff like engineering and all that, but there's a fair amount of money, even like governments spend a fair amount of money creating universities. And if what we're creating is just this ability of people to believe utter nonsense, like why do we even exist? If it seems like the first thing we should be doing as universities is like, oh, the entire population believes things that are nonsense. Shouldn't that be our job to fix that? It just,
that's actually a great line that, barring objection, I'll probably use on Twitter and so on today. Yeah, I mean, I think that, yeah, the idea, that's a fascinating idea. I mean, the ideal starting point for a useful academic or even journalistic enterprise would be saying the majority of people, whether that's due to childhood religious training or that's due to exposure to kind of non-news medias, how I think of, say, the Brit tabloids or whatever else, the majority of people believe a lot of things that are utterly nonsensical. I mean, to take one on the right, the world is ruled by a cabal of devil-worshipping pedophiles. The goal, now that actually is more likely to be true than some other things people believe. But,
fake but accurate comes to mind on some of that stuff.
Human male leaders tend to be pretty vampiric, and there's a pretty big literature on that. But anyway, like let the kids in on all that immediately. But when people come in with these beliefs, and the full-on belief I just described obviously is nonsensical. It should be the job of information purveyors to change the false belief to a true one by providing accurate information. I don't know if I believe that, in fact, I don't believe that most fields in a modern university, sociology even, but certainly any of the studies, so on down the line, do that, play that role. And that even the studies, I mean, have some quants in them and are talking about real issues of race. I mean, then you get into many of the humanities, which are just straight POMO. I remember I was a smart guy in college, unsurprisingly, I guess I'm academic now. But I mean, I took a range of classes, and I still remember just the level of utter nonsense that was involved in a lot of them. Whether you're talking about auditing an education course, or you're talking about just taking a classic, book by book course in literature, the sort of debates about whether Moby Dick represents the Republic of Ireland and so on, you start thinking that many of these people are reasonably intelligent, but are simply employed in the production of bullshit. And that's probably pretty accurate. But with a final comment here, with the university, I think another issue is kind of mission conflict. So, I mean, I teach at a solid comprehensive state university, K-State, and our professors are quite good. I mean, like looking down my academic hallway, I mean, we have Dr. Amadife, who's a guy from Nigeria, who's our Africanist. I mean, we have a Senator, Reginald Thomas, who's our criminal justice and practical politics professor, Kentucky senator. I mean, we've got Fred Williams, who's a former state police, more than captain, whatever the brass rank above that is, who teaches some of the CJ. I mean, the faculty in most institutions like this are pretty solid. I mean, the academic rat race is very competitive. Like even winding up in a top, X hundred state university is not a bad result. There's something like 5,000 colleges in the country. So these are often some of the leading geniuses in society. The problem, to such an extent that term has any validity, 500 decent institutions with 150 people apiece, that's a small cadre. Anyway, the issue I think with academia often is the limitations placed on the faculty by bureaucracy. I think the large majority of faculty members, for selfish reasons, but also thinking logically, would agree with that statement. But when you mentioned that the letter you're describing from Texas didn't come out of even the sociology department, it came out of the DEI office. I mean, it would surprise most people to know that at the typical university, there are more non-faculty executive staff than there are faculty members. So I don't want to get into a long ramble about this, but I assume you have the same stuff we do. I mean, Greek life. I don't know how much DEI we have at an all-black college, but it just goes on down the line. There are 25 people in admissions. Do a great job, but is that?
Yeah, we're heading towards just 3 in the business school full-time job for DEI. So
really in the business school alone?
Yeah, that's the target. It looks like. Yeah, I mean,
How
we're
many
all in on
professors
that
do you have in the
stuff.
business school?
Pardon?
Oh, how many faculty do you have in the business school?
Oh, I don't know, hundreds and hundreds. I mean, it's a
Oh,
pretty big business school, but yeah, we're definitely heading in that direction where, if current trends continue, everyone's going to be a DEI official and no one's going to be teaching anything, as far as I can tell.
yeah, well, I mean, we looked at a typical college a typical university in Kentucky at one point, and they had 110 faculty members, I believe, and 600 non-faculty staff. And I wouldn't be surprised if that's typical in many places. I assume that includes groundskeepers and so on, but it also includes all the offices and departments. Now, I mean, again, and if you really want to get serious about this, athletics at the University of Texas would probably employ more people than any individual department in the school. So at any rate,
yeah, we have 3 football coaches being paid at the same time for losing football games because we just keep these contracts rolling. But
yeah, no, well, Texas is pretty good out on the field and hook them, but
you've been paying attention recently?
Not this year. Yeah, bad year.
No bowl, but anyway.
Really, that's remarkable. Okay, but now isn't Texas moving to the SEC?
Mm-hmm. But now we get to pay players, so that helps. That's going to help a lot, I think. But anyway.
Yeah, so the SEC, their goal, I think, I know that they asked Michigan and Ohio State from the Big Ten to come in, just in total rejection of geographic logic. But I mean,
we've already rejected numerical coherency in the conferences. We might as well forget about geography too.
But I mean, just interesting stuff. And I mean, I really, actually, I'm kind of done with that point. I think that there are certainly many idiots among those that are well educated, but I really don't think the issue in most universities primarily rests with the faculty. There are a lot of great people on the staff side, but there really is the question of, once you get some of these sinecure jobs in place, how long are they going to be there? I mean, there was Nicholas Christakis recently posted on Twitter sort of a comprehensive meta-analysis. They looked at 492 studies looking at the effects of DEI. And obviously he wasn't the lead author, but it's a fascinating thread. He comments on it. And the basic conclusion was that spending money on diversity, equity, and inclusion, or on related things like implicit associations testing, has no effect on any measure of race relations, except for 2 where it had a slight negative effect. So it's literally, if this spend is, say, 5% of a typical Fortune 500 business or large university, it's just wasted money. Like there's no effect. It does almost nothing. So I thought that was just extremely funny as a lifelong critic of bureaucrats. Like, what do? Nothing, it turns out.
But I mean, if you can get if your job is to solve a problem that doesn't exist.
Yes,
it's like life. Like, well, of course it's not getting better. It's not there, so it doesn't get better. So it seems like a pretty good gig, right?
Well, the problem is that there are almost 2 levels of parasitism, though. One would be kind of harmless, friendly parasitism, like where you take the guy who's in this role out for drinks or some golf every couple of weeks, and they're just there. And if there is a racism case, they do a good job. That really, it's not very useful, but it's not a problem. The problem with many people in these roles, are you familiar with the old, like, classic breakdown and just straight business of the different types of leaders, like smart, active, and so on?
I've heard references to it.
Yeah, I mean, it's not brilliant stuff, but like the worst kind of leader is dumb and active. So if you get someone in a leadership role, what you want in a DEI setting, I would say, is someone who's smart and inactive. Like, they genuinely oppose racism when they see it, twice a year, the quarterback and the running back get in a fight or something. They handle that, and then they go back to their office and they drink a scotch. I mean, that's what you want in that position. Nice, charming guy that you can trot out if the school gets sued. The worst thing to have in that position would be a dumb, active leader, because they would feel morally compelled to find forms of prejudice. One of the things that's interesting, especially to me as a Black guy, is the redefinition of what prejudice means. So I was in some interminable meeting that I won't name because then people would be able to identify it pretty recently. And I said something about, well, like, there's not a lot of racism here. And speaking as a Black man, I'll say this. And someone said, well, Black males are hardly the most oppressed group of people. You might be in the second power position in this country. And then they went on to discuss transphobia and so on down the line. And I mean, I think that that's a tempting logical extension. Like, if you find there's almost no racism on campus, and that really is the sector in which the DEI pros were originally hired, I mean, is there any homophobia? Is there some sex going on Greek Road that might involve alcohol? Like, there's going to be a desire to expand your purview and to take down new forms of bigotry. The trans thing, I think, is currently at the margin of this. The idea that it's discriminatory to keep, say, males who identify as females out of any student activity. So right now, I think that's kind of the frontier of DEI. Many colleges may not be racist, but they're transphobic. But this could extend really endlessly. A phenomenon that's related to this actually is white people rushing away from being identified with the master class. So I don't know if you've been on Tinder or any similar dating platform.
I'm way too old for that.
Fair enough. But I mean, I'm in a relationship myself, but I mean, when I look at what my buddies are doing or prior to my current commitment, I mean, one of the things I noticed was that there weren't any white women on the platform. And what I mean by that, obviously 70% of users are Caucasian. But what I mean by that is that almost everyone would identify as something like, you know, I am a bisexual Jewish American person of size, if they had any bio other than come over and have sex with me. But it was very much this sort of definition of I am not just a well-adjusted upper middle class white chick from Cleveland. And you see that very definitely, even if you're on Twitter, where people in their profile bios will say all the same sort of stuff. My pronouns are he, him, gender non-binary. But also now you're starting to see people describe themselves as neuroatypical. So sort of claiming what, you know, someone once described this as kind of crazy as a minority, but saying that I am, you know, the crude way, glib way of putting it, but saying, you know, I may not be black, but I have ADD. So all this is going to continue for some period of time, as long as we add value to victim status.
People figured out a way to, you know, well, you know, now everyone wants to be oppressed. So we come up with these categories that you get to opt into instead of being born into. And that does seem like it has this ability to create a cascade failure where at the end of the day, you know, everybody is going to end up like fighting to be in the, you know, highest oppression category. And, you know, somehow we've created status for oppression, which kind of seems to move against a lot of what society, you know, a lot of things that bind society together. Oh, well.
Yeah, no, I think that's correct. But I mean, just even in terms of that, the Twitter or Tinder bios we're describing, I mean, the effect that you're mentioning obviously is real. Like if there is a negative association with being a preppy white girl, people are going to start looking for other potential categories. I mean, so like I'm a 1/16th Native American, you know, secondary race, bisexual. 1/2040th Native American. Well, the funniest thing about that particular Native sister is that she apparently was involved in like the Indian movement. Like there's a book called Powwow Chow, which first of all is just incredibly, I mean, I might have picked a different title, but Elizabeth Warren contributed a recipe to that. And it was something like wild prairie crab cakes. It was just the most non-native sounding thing imaginable, but with a cute Pocahontas-like title in front of it. At any rate, but yeah, I mean, what you see is the person who normally would have been, you know, stable white chick saying, you know, instead I'm a 1/16th Native American, bisexual, non-binary person of size who may be on the spectrum. And one of the issues with this is that it complicates resolving the remaining actual problems in society. There's not a great deal of racism, but I mean, there still are realities due in part to social class. People also could study more across a range of groups, but due in part to the social class, past racism. Say Latinos score behind whites on, you know, the annual aptitude boards, the SAT and so on. So you could attempt to close that gap and get more Latinos into STEM. But to do that, you have to be able to focus on Latinos or racial minorities as a class. Like there's obviously no performance difference between 1/16th Native American bisexual party girls who are on the spectrum and the rest of the people who are basically just white. So as you get distracted by these new made up victim categories, it becomes harder to come up with any kind of comprehensive strategy to get the kids to study more or whatever. So we'll see what happens down the road, I guess.
Okay. Yeah, there's a lot of information, but sorry, I'm just processing everything. I'm trying to move. But yeah, so I did want to hit, you are defending a little bit the faculty versus the administrators, but you do, I mean, certainly at UT, there are rules about what you can and cannot
of course.
find. Like, you know, if your regression coefficient goes one way, you get investigated. If the regression coefficient goes the other way, you get a a big press release. So do you see that as a problem, the sort of filtering on?
Of course.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, when I talk about the faculty, I think in general that if you removed the large administrative state from most universities, you would see a freer knowledge environment and you would see a better production of knowledge via research. That's my thesis there. Do I think that I think that, first of all, you have to look at what you mean by faculty. There are entire fields that were kind of set up during the 60s radical movement to accommodate former radicals. That's how Black study or people that were thought to be unable to perform at, the UT or UK or whatever level at that time for whatever reason. But that's how Black studies, women's studies, the entire grievance sector, which is now.
I mean, why it became so important to create faculty positions for the Weather Underground, I do not understand, right? Like, why is the natural next step in your life after setting bombs and trying to overthrow society and bring about totalitarian oligarchy, then you become a professor? Like, how did that?
Well, because they read Gramsci. This is a piece totally non-quantitative, just my babble, that I might submit to some kind, if I can find a non-radical philosophy journal or journal of thought. One of the things that's really fascinating about American thought life is, on the left, the influence of people like Gramsci and is the education guy pronounced Freire? Paulo.
I'm better. I was just having a discussion with a Brazilian about him, but I can't remember exactly.
Let's call him PF, so there can't just be clips. That guy.
Who's the most popular, one of the most popular authors in education schools.
Yes, but if you look at a lot of the writing, Gramsci is the classic example of this. We can leave PF to the side right now. But one of the ideas in sort of Alinsky, I mean, right here in America, recent past, one of the main ideas in radical thought is that radicals are unlikely to be popular and powerful in a lot of the traditional schema worlds that have influence in society. They're not going to take over war, the militaries, although we're seeing that to a surprising degree today, interestingly enough. But you're not going to see massive radical influence in sport, in agriculture, so on down the line. So as a radical, where can you go have an influence? Gramsci's answer was discourse, essentially. I mean, at the time, he's probably thinking of radio and pamphleteering and so on. But people following that line of thought, certainly people who've read Alinsky and who understood what the Weather Underground said in the 60s, have often tended to try to go into fields where they can present radical ideas to new, impressionable people. So, I mean, you see higher education, you see secondary education, you see journalism, you see broadcast media, you see print media. And this has been remarkably successful. I mean, to the point where the introductions of books will gloat, where did we go after the revolution failed, after they broke us once? We went to the campus to build the next wave. I mean, these are quotes, or close to them. So the extent to which this has been successful, and I'll loop back to the main point about the conflict within the faculty in a sec, but the extent to which this has been successful is pretty remarkable. I mean, obviously some of the best known data, at least in my field, is Pew 2004, when they asked national news media journalists, what are your political affiliations? What are your partisan affiliations? And they found that, you might correct this by a point or two, but 7% of national media journalists were conservatives of any kind. Mm-hmm. That would include libertarians. I assume that would probably include the center right. That was this block over here. The other 93% of people would be leftists, liberals, or moderates, with most of the moderates leaning left. I mean, that's that. It's 93-7. That's the split. You find a sharper split, unbelievably, in academia. So, I mean, there's a paper, The Prevalence of Marxism in Academia, which you can find hosted on sort of the Econ Live resource for papers right now. And in social science, which is really our focus, I think, 18% of professors are communists. Another 21% identify as radical activists. And another 24%, something like that, everyone should look up this paper themselves, but identify as just activists or committed radicals. And it's probably 21% for actual activists, 24% for radical. But those are three different questions on the survey, as I recall. So I mean, you get 18 plus 20 plus 24. About 60% of the people in the academic professoriate in the social sciences are hard to the left, radical on the left. So whatever the original light bulb insight that went on in Alinsky's head or Hoffman's or whatever, saying, well, this is the path we should pursue, they have pursued it. And that's why, I don't know if you feel this way, but even I feel gaslit pretty often. I mean, you'll see people saying things that just seem insane. Oh, sex is hard to define. Human population variation doesn't exist. Crime doesn't contribute to encounters with the police. Guns don't prevent crime. And you think, can all these smart people be wrong?
Well, but what I've encountered recently is like, we have like official, we have the University of Texas will pay people to come train our faculty for sort of public, and they're teaching them explicitly, things like don't let facts get in the way of effectiveness. Like we're telling our faculty that they should lie in order to promote, the interest of marginalized groups. They're pretty explicit in this. So, that's, I definitely, I just assume anyone who's talking is lying as an academic now. So I don't consider myself gaslit very often, but you hear it seems like it's a fairly explicit story of like, you are supposed to make things up to convince people of these sort of ideas. Did you see the Sokol 3 hoax?
The Sokol 3, you're talking about James Lindsay and those guys?
No, the one that came after him, where they got these anonymous faculty got a paper in an education journal showing that Koch money makes everyone hire unqualified conservatives and pushes everything to the right.
I've heard about it. I won't pretend I'm familiar. That's hilarious.
Oh, it's worth reading. It's very good. It got in a high, but it's exactly this, like, well, okay, this information is clearly nonsense, but it promotes our agenda, so we're going to publish it. I highly rate it. It's a work of art. It's one of the best papers I've ever read. I think check out the regression specification. It's beautiful.
This is funny. I'll definitely check that out. The thing that's interesting about this is that I think I've heard this paper non-ironically praised. Like I would bet.
When it first got out, like the first Twitter hits were like, oh, look at this. We're right. The right is taking over. And then gradually people were like, wait a second. There's 17 typos in the abstract.
Yeah, I think that
it's published, or it got published.
I think that, so how to respond to that? First, this is absolutely 100% the paper that I saw widely praised on social when it came out. I'm guessing about a year and a half ago, because that's when people were saying that the reality in academia is that conservative funding causes it to lean right. Mm-hmm. And gradually people just stopped citing this paper. By the way, this is extraordinarily common if you want to talk about major failures. I mean, the most recent thing I quote unquote trended for on social, and something that will be my next sort of at least popular press article, if not beyond that. Did you see the native residential schools thing in Canada?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, this was absolutely wild. I mean, I want to hear your take too, but just a quick intro. I mean, obviously this is one of the leading stories, at least north of the border, for months. The claim was that a mass grave involving 215 bodies of Native kids that had died at one of their residential schools, and the underlying assumption was that had not been reported, that perhaps had been murdered, had been found. It had absolutely been detected, and they'd found 215 bodies outside the Kamloops Native Residential Boarding Center, as I recall is the name of the place. And it turns out that this obscure Canadian review published a piece, a very good piece, by the way, nothing wrong with putting an article there, but published a piece by a guy at the University of Montreal who said, well, let's look at this. What they used was sort of standard ground mapping radar, and they didn't find any bodies because that doesn't dig. What they found were X number of disturbances under the ground. And after looking at this with some knowledge of the field, I think they're tree roots. Not a single body's been discovered. We need to excavate before we can make any claims at all. So the media's totally failed here. But also, it seems really unlikely this could have happened because neither natives or whites in the 1950s were sort of, unlettered barbarians. There were registers of everyone to die at the school. And the school's located on a successful Indian reservation known for its fishermen. There's no chance this happened. But as a result of the original story, which ran throughout the Canadian press and throughout the upper end, even to some extent academic media around the world, I mean, something like 10 Catholic churches were burned. There were violent clashes between whites and natives. People were hurt and believed killed. So these sort of things, another story that comes to mind is the claim that hate crimes surged 226% in counties that held Trump rallies. That was the front page of the Washington Post. It turned out there was a 226% increase in Trump rally counties. I actually looked at the methods on this. I was one of the people to criticize them. There was a 226% increase in Trump rally counties over non-Trump rally counties. But that's in the sense that 2 is 200% of 1. The increase in one set of counties was 1%, and the other set of counties, it was 2%. So this extraordinary bullshit drops all the time. And you literally have to be a statistician to look at it and say, oh, that's the mistake. It's pretty remarkable. So yeah, the faculty bears some blame here as well. But I mean, I think my 2-sentence defense there would be, you're talking about a specific subset of faculty that are encouraging this kind of thing. And I think generally you can tell where they're going to be concentrated. And that itself occurs within this administrative superstructure. Like there's a DEI office, there's pretty much everything. I mean, there's review of the projects that you're doing on every major campus. All of this occurs. I don't think the faculty left to their own devices. If you read The Fall of the Faculty, it's on would have approved 90% of this, but there it is.
Yeah, but they won't, they might not approve it, but they're sure as not going to fight back against it or do the right thing. Right? Yeah, there's an element of faculty cowardice that I find perhaps even more disturbing. Okay, at least respect the people who are using their positions to destroy civilization for fun and profit, but these people who are just like lie down for it because they're just too afraid someone will get angry at them, I can't respect that at all. But that's my take.
No, I agree with that, but I also think that another element, so the 3 elements would be 1, the administrative superstructure, 2, the departments that are entirely radical, but I mean, there's also just 3, the light ideological bias. So in any field other than pure STEM, where they're still mostly doing their own thing, for now. But I mean, in any field, even in psychometrics or something like that, you're probably talking about a 70-30 left-right split. So it's weird. Most people that are centrists or conservatives and that really oppose academia on these issues would just go work for a good think tank or something like that, or go into business if you're talking about the sciences, do research for much more money. So it's a kind of self-selecting process. It's almost impossible to imagine some stylish conservative girl that's written a couple pieces for like the Daily Wire going on after the master's to become an English professor. And I think a question for those of us in academia would be, why is that almost inconceivable? But the reality is that it is, and that affects the environment. It's actually, respect what you're doing. It's a tough environment to stand up in.
I mean, we have our inclusion policy, which basically says you can't hire people like that person who might go work for the Daily Wire. So it's becoming pretty institutionalized.
Well, that's something that I don't think people understand. I mean, if you ask people if they support, say, full-on trans inclusion in every sector, or what their plan for complete equity across group lines is, that's just an ideological litmus test. I'm not sure. In fact, I don't think I could sign on to either of those, any sector. Equity, I almost totally oppose. I want to see the people that do the best on the tests, assuming the equivalent prep time for the minority kids and so on, get into university. My admissions policy for universities would be extraordinarily simple. About 60% tests, 40% grades with a 5% boost for varsity athletes, maybe. I mean, that's it. And so once you do that, you don't, and the 5% is a maybe. Once you do that, you also just roll a ball out in the gym and let everyone who got in compete to be on the team. There'd be just as much support. But
the total number of wins in college athletics is fixed. We don't really need to be anyway.
Well, yeah, the whole idea that you should, this is a situation where you're right, the win total is 0-sum, but there's also really no advantage to not just doing what I suggested. Like, you could take big guys on your campus who came from the farm or the hood, but who actually made the scores to get there, and have those guys play some football. Or you could spend $26 million a year, whatever it is for you guys, recruiting the best athletes in the country and then have them play some football. But you're going to have the same stadium, the same scenery, so on down the line. I mean, if you look at some of the games that are like the most watched outside of the state of Texas, I will say, but there are things like Army, Navy, and Harvard, Yale, where the athletes are on par with some of the guys I knew in high school. But it doesn't matter. So anyway, that's my thought on college athletics. But consider the 5%. We can debate that in faculty senate or whatever. But that's a 1-minute admissions policy, and that, by the way, would also remove the need for a massive woke Department of Admissions. You've got 50 guys reading the equivalent of resumes. Why? I worked on a very large sales floor in Chicago for a couple of years, intense bullpen environment. I mean, we would do the hiring. The bullpen guys would just take the resumes, look through them, and decide whether someone seemed functional or not. If you want to avoid any element of racism, and people sometimes did this even in this bro environment, just cross out everyone's name with a black pen. You have no idea who's who. It's really simple to do these things. They're being intentionally complicated for a reason. It's important to keep that in mind.
Yeah, no, I know. And if anyone is looking to set up a new university, I think you've found your admissions dean.
I'd be very willing to play. See, I would be in that case. I wouldn't be a useless cynic here. I have 3 books I want to get ready to go down the pipe. But I mean, that I would be the guy relaxing in the office, drinking scotch in that role. Like once a year, they would send me a bunch of application packets, CVs, whatever you want to call them. I'd look through them. I'd calculate, I do a good, honest job. I'd calculate SAT score, matrix against grades, see if people played some ball, and that's it.
Yep.
And we admit, whatever the number is, 3,000 each spring, each fall, and life goes on. There's really not much need for any more than that, but we've created a entire process around more than that. One thing that's interesting about academia is the question of, is it salvageable? When I was getting out into the working world, because I got out of high school in '99, I'm an adult man, downsizing was just coming to an end, where the entire corporate America had realized, competing with the Japanese and to a lesser extent the Euros, India was starting to rise, but corporate America had realized that we had these entire useless layers of middle management. You've seen Office Space, I'm sure.
Oh yeah.
It's classic, but anyone with a job should watch it. But just the classic, what do you do? Well, I'm the guy who interfaces between sales and engineering. But why? Well, because the goddamn engineers don't have people skills. That actually existed. You had one middle manager for every 3 clerical level employees or whatever. And companies started asking, what do these guys do other than sleep with secretaries? Why couldn't we replace all of these guys with one old school computer in the front of the office? And they did. In academia, the question is, will there be the resolve to do the same thing? If you have 600 executive staff people for every 100 professors on a pretty typical campus in a heartland state, is it feasible that infrastructure goes away? If it's not, academia has a real problem. You're not going to see an influx of right-leaning faculty or even just heterodox faculty. I've talked to Colin Wright about this, for example, but you're not going to see that until you get rid of something like the full-on equity statement in the hard sciences. That's almost an unbelievably nonsensical contradiction there.
Well, I don't want to take up any, this has been absolutely fascinating. I don't want to take up any more of your time, but hopefully we can do this again sometime. Thank you. So thanks very much to Professor Reilly.
Well, thank you. Thanks for having me.